There are moments when a single empty chair can tell you exactly how much you're worth. The chair scraped across the marble floor with a sharp, deliberate sound that cut through the soft hum of conversation. And then it was gone, pulled back and folded against the wall as if it had never belonged there at all. As if Margaret Hayes had never belonged there at all. And for a second no one spoke. Not at a table dressed in white linen and crystal glasses and a centerpiece of fresh peonies that Daniel had ordered 2 days earlier. Not on a Sunday afternoon that was supposed to celebrate mothers, because everyone felt it, that shift in the air, that quiet fracture that turns a family gathering into something colder, something measured. And then Olivia Carter smiled, lifting her champagne flute just slightly, her voice calm and practiced as she said, "We decided to keep things simpler this year." And the way she said simpler made it sound like an upgrade, like refinement, like removing something unnecessary. And Margaret stood there at the head of the table where her place setting had been just moments ago, her fingers still lightly touching the back of a chair that was no longer hers, her eyes moving from plate to plate, from face to face, searching for something that looked like hesitation, or discomfort, or even basic recognition. But Daniel was already looking down at his phone, scrolling as if this were just another minor adjustment, just another detail handled. And a few of the guests shifted awkwardly but didn't speak, because silence is easier when the room is expensive and the host seems confident. And somewhere behind the camera phones were already being raised, not openly, not yet, but enough to capture the moment if it turned into something worth sharing. Because people sense those things, the edge of something viral, the possibility of witnessing a story that will later be told with phrases like, "You wouldn't believe what happened next." And Margaret felt all of it in a single breath, the years compressed into one quiet instant. The school lunches packed before sunrise, the late-night bills balanced at a kitchen table with a calculator that clicked too loudly, the sacrifices that never made it into conversations like this one. And still she didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for her seat back. Instead, she straightened her posture just slightly, the way she used to when life demanded more strength and comfort. And she smiled. Not wide, not performative, just enough to unsettle the rhythm Olivia had carefully created, because something about that smile didn't match the script, didn't follow the expected pattern of embarrassment or retreat. And Olivia noticed, just for a fraction of a second, her expression tightening before smoothing out again as she continued. The real gift this year is honesty. And the word honesty landed heavier than intended, like it carried more weight than the room understood. And then, just as the tension began to settle into something permanent, something that would be remembered, as the moment Margaret Hayes lost her place at her own family table, the front door opened with a soft but unmistakable click, and every head turned at once. Not because they expected anything, but because timing like that doesn't happen by accident. And a man stepped inside, mid-30s, tailored suit, the kind of presence that shifts attention without asking for it. His eyes scanning the room once before landing directly on Margaret, and in a voice calm enough to silence everything else, he said, "Sorry I'm late, Mom." And just like that, the definition of who belonged at that table began to change. For a moment, no one moved. Not even Olivia, whose fingers tightened almost invisibly around the stem of her glass, because the word Mom did not belong to anyone in that room except the woman she had just erased. And yet this man had said it with certainty, with ease, as if there had never been any question about where he stood. And Margaret's smile shifted just slightly, not wider, but steadier, like a piece of a puzzle quietly clicking into place while everyone else was still trying to understand the picture. And Daniel finally looked up from his phone, confusion flashing across his face as he scanned the stranger from head to toe, measuring, calculating, searching for context he did not have, while a low murmur began to ripple through the guests, subtle but undeniable, because people recognize disruption when they see it, especially the kind that carries confidence instead of chaos. And the man stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft, controlled motion, his shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. Yet somehow every step seemed louder than the last, not because of noise, but because of what it implied. And he did not rush. He did not apologize again. He simply walked toward Margaret as if the path had always been his to take. And when he reached her, he placed a hand gently at her shoulder, a gesture so natural it made the absence of it before feel deliberate, and he said, "Traffic was worse than expected, but I would not miss this." And the phrasing hung there. Careful, intentional, as if he understood exactly what kind of moment he had walked into. And Olivia let out a small, controlled laugh, the kind people use when they are trying to reclaim a room that is slipping away from them. And she said, "I am sorry, I think there is some confusion," her tone still polished, but now carrying an edge that had not been there before. "This is a private family event." And the word private landed like a boundary she expected everyone to respect, but the man did not react the way most people would. He did not step back. He did not hesitate. He simply turned his gaze toward her, calm, observant, and said, "That is exactly why I am here." And something in the way he said it made the room quieter than before, not tense, but attentive, like the moment just before a reveal, and Margaret finally moved her hand away from the empty space where her chair had been, her posture no longer searching, no longer uncertain, as if the absence that had defined the last few minutes had just been replaced by something far more solid. And Daniel stood up halfway from his seat, unsure whether he was about to intervene or retreat, his voice catching slightly as he said, "Mom, who is this?" And it was the first time he had said the word mom that day, the first time it had been directed at her. And the timing did not go unnoticed, not by Margaret, not by the guests, and certainly not by the man, who let the silence stretch just long enough to make every second count before answering. "That depends on how honest we are planning to be today." And a few of the guests exchanged glances, because that word again, honesty, had now appeared. Twice, from two different directions, carrying two very different meanings, and Olivia's expression tightened despite her effort to maintain control, her eyes flicking briefly to Daniel, as if expecting support. But Daniel did not move, did not speak, because something about this moment no longer felt like something he understood, and the man reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, not in a threatening way, but in a way that signaled intention, and when he pulled out a thin folder, placing it gently on the table where Margaret's plate had been removed just minutes earlier, the symbolism was impossible to ignore, because where there had been nothing, now there was evidence, and he looked at Margaret once, a quiet confirmation passing between them, before turning back to the room and saying, "I think it is time we talk about who actually belongs at this table." The room did not breathe, not fully, not yet, because something had shifted from uncomfortable to undeniable, and everyone could feel it in the way their attention locked onto that folder resting where Margaret's place had been, as if the table itself had changed sides, and Olivia was the first to move, not forward but slightly back, a subtle adjustment that only someone watching closely would notice, her smile returning but thinner now, stretched over uncertainty as she said, "I think this is unnecessary." Her voice still controlled but no longer effortless, and the man did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply opened the folder with a calm precision, sliding a single document forward across the table, the paper stopping just short of Olivia's hand, and for a second she did not touch it, because sometimes hesitation is louder than refusal, and Daniel leaned in, instinctively, his eyes scanning the page before Olivia could react, his expression shifting in real time from confusion to disbelief, and then something sharper, something closer to realization. What is this?" he asked, but the question did not carry authority, it carried doubt. And the man answered without looking at him, his gaze steady on Olivia. "It is ownership," he said, the word landing clean and heavy. "The property, the accounts, the trust that holds everything connected to this house." And a quiet murmur spread again, faster this time, because money translates across any room, and the guests did not need full details to understand the direction of the conversation. And Olivia finally picked up the document, her fingers tightening just slightly as her eyes moved across the lines, searching for something that would disprove it, something she could use to dismiss it. But the longer she read, the less she spoke, and that silence began to speak for her, and Margaret remained still, watching, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of calm that comes from knowing the outcome before the reveal. And Daniel stepped back from the table as if distance might help him process what he was seeing, his voice quieter now as he said, "This does not make sense. We bought this house. We built this." And the man finally turned toward him, not unkindly, but without hesitation. "You lived in it," he said. "There is a difference." And the distinction cut deeper than any raised voice could have, because it reframed everything in a single sentence. And a guest near the end of the table let out a soft exhale, the kind people do when they realize they are witnessing something they will later describe in detail, something that will sound exaggerated even when it is not. And Olivia placed the document back down, carefully, as if any sudden movement might make it more real, her eyes lifting to Margaret for the first time without superiority, without dismissal, but with something closer to calculation, as if she were trying to reevaluate a person she thought she had already defined, and Margaret met that look without flinching, without offering explanation, because the explanation was already on the table, and the man closed the folder halfway, not fully, leaving just enough visible to remind everyone that the conversation was not finished. And then he said, "For years, she chose not to say anything." His voice even, measured. "She allowed you to feel comfortable, to feel in control, because sometimes silence is not weakness, it is patience." And the word patience settled differently than anything else that had been said, because it implied time, intention, and a decision that had nothing to do with today alone. And Daniel looked at his mother again, really looked this time, as if seeing her without the assumptions he had built over the years. And the question that followed came slower, heavier. "Mom, why did you never tell me?" And Margaret finally moved, not toward the table, not toward the document, but toward the empty space where her chair had been, her hand resting there once more, steady, grounded, as she said quietly, "Because I wanted to see who you would become without it." And the answer did not raise her voice, but it changed the weight of every choice that had been made in that room, including the one that had taken her seat away just minutes before. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, because what Margaret had just said was not loud, not dramatic, yet it rearranged everything in a way that could not be undone. And Daniel felt it first, the shift from confusion to something more uncomfortable, something that made him look down at his own hands as if they might explain how he had missed it, how he had overlooked the quiet strength standing in front of him for so many years. And Olivia inhaled slowly, controlled, measured, as if she were recalibrating in real time, her mind moving faster than her expression allowed, because losing control in front of an audience was not something she accepted easily. And she reached for her glass again, not to drink, but to anchor herself, to reclaim a sense of normalcy that no longer existed. And she said, "Even if that is true, it does not change the fact that this is our home now." Her voice sharper than before, the confidence returning but edged with urgency. And the man glanced at the folder, then back at her, and there was no hesitation when he answered. "Legally, it has always been hers." And the word "always" carried a quiet finality that made the air feel tighter, and a guest near the center of the table shifted in their seat, whispering something under their breath that caused another to nod, because the narrative was no longer controlled by the host. It was unfolding on its own terms, and Margaret finally moved. The chair back from the wall, the same chair that had been removed just minutes earlier, the legs sliding softly against the floor, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. And every eye followed that motion, not because it was aggressive, but because it was certain. And she did not rush. She did not look at Olivia for permission. She simply placed the chair back where it had been, aligning it with the table as if restoring something that had been temporarily misplaced. And Daniel watched her do it, his expression caught between guilt and realization, because the act itself was simple, but what it represented was not. And Olivia opened her mouth as if to protest, then stopped, because interruption now would only confirm what everyone was already beginning to see. And the man stepped slightly to the side, giving Margaret space, without needing to be asked, a gesture that said more than any declaration could. And Margaret rested her hand on the back of the chair for a moment, just long enough for the room to settle into the new reality, before she spoke again, her voice calm, steady. "I was invited here today as a guest in my own home," she said, and the phrasing landed with precision, because it was not accusation, it was observation. And observations are harder to argue with. And she continued, "But I see now that I misunderstood something." And Olivia's grip on her glass tightened again, the faintest crack forming in her composure as she tried to anticipate where this was going. Because for the first time, she was not leading the moment, she was reacting to it. And Margaret looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes briefly, not to challenge, but to acknowledge, as if recognizing witnesses to something that would be remembered long after the plates were cleared. And then she said, "This was never about a seat." And the pause that followed was not empty. It was deliberate, allowing the meaning to settle before she finished. It was about respect, and the word did not need to be raised to be heard, because it carried through the room on its own. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the realization fully landing now, not just about the house, not just about the documents, but about the choices that had led to this moment. And Olivia lowered her glass slightly, her eyes moving between Margaret and the man, calculating again, searching for a way to regain control. But control requires certainty, and certainty was no longer hers. And somewhere near the end of the table, a phone camera shifted just enough to capture Margaret standing beside her chair, composed, unshaken, while the rest of the room adjusted around her. And in that quiet, unmistakable shift, it became clear that the person who had been removed from the table had never truly lost her place, and the people who thought they owned it were only just beginning to understand what it meant to sit there. The word respect did not fade. It lingered, pressing gently but firmly against every person at the table. And for the first time since the afternoon began, no one rushed to fill the silence, because there was nothing casual left to say. And Olivia understood that before anyone else, her posture straightening as she placed her glass down with careful precision, as if reclaiming control required visible intention, and she said, "Respect goes both ways," her voice steady again but carrying a sharper edge. And respect also means knowing when to step back. And the implication was clear, subtle but pointed, an attempt to reframe the moment without directly confronting the truth already sitting in front of her. And a few guests shifted slightly, sensing the tension pivot once more, because this was no longer just a reveal, it was a negotiation of power happening in real time. And Margaret listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, not dismissive, not defensive, just attentive, as if she were allowing Olivia the space to finish what she needed to say before deciding whether it mattered. And Daniel glanced between them, the weight of the situation settling deeper with each second, because the structure he had relied on, the assumptions he had built his life around, were quietly unraveling, and he could not find a place to stand that felt certain anymore. And the man beside Margaret remained still, not intervening, not adding pressure, because his role had already shifted the balance. And now the outcome belonged to her. And Margaret finally moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning, and she pulled the chair back just enough to sit, the motion smooth, deliberate, as if it had always been hers to complete. And when she lowered herself into the seat, the room seemed to adjust around that single action. Conversations that had not yet started suddenly felt unnecessary, and Olivia's eyes followed the movement, her composure holding but tightening at the edges, because the symbolism was impossible to ignore. And Margaret rested her hands lightly on the table, her fingers relaxed against the white linen, and she said, "You are right." Her voice even, measured, and the agreement caught Olivia slightly off guard, just enough to break the rhythm she had been trying to rebuild. "Respect does go both ways," Margaret continued, and she paused, not for effect, but to allow the truth of that statement to settle before she added, "Which is why I never demanded it." And that distinction shifted the meaning entirely, because it reframed years of silence not as absence, but as choice. And a quiet realization moved through the guests, visible in the way they leaned slightly forward, in the way their attention sharpened, because they were no longer watching a conflict, they were witnessing a conclusion. And Daniel exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders lowering as if the resistance he had not even recognized was beginning to give way. And he looked at his mother, really looked, seeing not just who she was now, but who she had always been beneath everything he had overlooked. And Olivia opened her mouth, then stopped, because every response she could form felt smaller than the moment unfolding in front of her. And Margaret's gaze moved to her briefly, not confrontational, not triumphant, just steady. And she said, "Today was not about taking a seat. and the repetition echoed her earlier words, but carried a deeper clarity now. It was about showing you that I never lost it. And the sentence did not rise, did not push, it simply settled into the space between them, undeniable, and the man beside her allowed the silence to hold. Because some truths do not need reinforcement, and at the far end of the table, someone quietly set their phone down, as if recognizing that what they had just captured was not just a moment, but a shift that would be talked about long after this day ended. And in that stillness, with Margaret seated calmly where she had always belonged, it became clear that the power in the room had not changed hands, it had simply been revealed. No one clapped, no one spoke, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any reaction could have, because the moment did not need validation, it demanded reflection, and Daniel felt it pressing in on him from every direction, the realization settling deeper with each passing second as he looked at his mother, sitting calmly at the table, not reclaiming power, but revealing it had always been there. And he finally pulled his chair back slightly, the movement hesitant at first, then firmer as he stood up fully, his voice quieter than it had been all afternoon as he said, "I did not see it." And the admission did not sound like an excuse, it sounded like recognition, and Margaret turned her gaze toward him, not immediately, not sharply, but with the same measured calm she had carried through everything. And she did not rush to respond, because some acknowledgments need space to exist before they are answered, and Olivia remained seated, her posture still composed, but the tension now visible in the small details, the way her fingers rested too firmly against the edge of the table, the way her eyes moved more frequently than before, scanning for control that was no longer hers to direct, and she said, "This is being blown out of proportion," her tone steady but quieter, as if lowering her voice might restore balance. It was just a misunderstanding about seating, and the word misunderstanding felt smaller than everything that had already unfolded, and a few guests shifted again, not in agreement, but in quiet awareness that the explanation no longer matched the moment, and the man standing beside Margaret glanced briefly at her, a silent check, and she gave the slightest nod, a permission not to intervene, because this part did not belong to him, and Margaret folded her hands lightly together on the table, her posture relaxed, grounded, and she said, "It was never about the chair," repeating it once more, not to emphasize, but to anchor the truth where it could not be moved. And she looked at Olivia, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity, and it was not a misunderstanding, and the distinction was gentle but firm, leaving no space for reinterpretation. And Olivia held her gaze for a moment, longer than before, as if testing whether there was any room left to shift the narrative. But what she found instead was certainty, and certainty is difficult to argue with. And Daniel stepped closer to the table, his attention no longer divided, no longer distracted, as he said, "Mom, I should have said something." And the sentence carried more than regret, it carried the weight of everything he had not done. And Margaret listened, her expression softening just slightly, not in forgiveness yet, but in acknowledgement of the moment itself, and she replied, "You are saying it now." And the response did not erase the past, but it opened something forward, and the man beside her took a small step back, creating space without withdrawing, because the center of the room had shifted fully to her, and at the far end of the table, one of the guests quietly adjusted their seat, as if instinctively, aligning with the new balance that had formed, and Olivia finally set her glass down completely, both hands now resting flat against the table, a sign not of surrender, but of recalculation, and she said, "So what happens now?" And the question was simple, but it carried everything: control, consequence, position, and for the first time, it was directed not at the room, but at Margaret. And Margaret did not answer immediately. She let the question exist, let it settle into the quiet that had replaced the earlier tension, and then she reached forward slightly, adjusting the edge of her plate by less than an inch, a small, almost invisible action, but one that signaled something deeper, a return to order on her terms, and she said, "Now," her voice calm, steady, "we decide what this table stands for." And the words did not raise the stakes, they clarified them, and in that moment, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer about a single day or a single seat. It was about the foundation of everything that came after, and Margaret, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, had become the one defining it. The question did not rush the room. It settled into it, slow and deliberate, because when Margaret said they would decide what the table stood for, she was not asking for opinions, she was setting a standard, and everyone felt it, even the ones who had not spoken a single word all afternoon. And Olivia was the first to respond, not out of confidence this time, but out of necessity, because silence now worked against her, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice measured, controlled. "This table stands for family," she said, as if stating something obvious might restore authority. But the word family did not carry the same weight it had earlier. It felt thinner now, tested, and Daniel looked at her, then back at his mother, the contrast clearer than it had ever been, and Margaret nodded once, acknowledging the word without accepting it as complete, and she said, "Family is not a title," her tone calm, almost reflective. "It is a pattern," and the phrasing caused a few of the guests to shift again, because it reframed something they thought they understood into something they now had to consider. And she continued, "It is what you do when no one is watching, and what you choose when it costs you something." And the room grew quieter, not because people were uncomfortable, but because they were listening differently now, and Olivia held her gaze, her composure still intact, but her certainty beginning to narrow, as if the space she had once controlled was closing in around her, and she said, "Are you saying I do not belong here?" And the question was direct, sharper than before, but it carried something new, something closer to concern than challenge. And Margaret did not answer immediately. She allowed the question to sit, to reveal itself fully before responding, and then she said, "I am saying that belonging is not something you claim." And she paused, her eyes steady. "It is something you build." And the distinction landed clearly, leaving no room for interpretation, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as if the tension he had been holding all day was finally releasing. And he pulled his chair back further, sitting down. Again, not out of habit, but with intention this time, aligning himself with the shift that had taken place. And he looked at his mother, his voice quieter, more grounded. "Then I have not built it well." And the admission was simple, but it carried weight. And Margaret looked at him for a moment, not with disappointment, not with approval, but with recognition, as if acknowledging that understanding had finally begun. And she said, "You are still building." And the words did not absolve him, but they gave direction, and the man beside her remained silent, his presence no longer disruptive, but reinforcing, like a structure that did not need to be seen to be understood. And at the far end of the table, one of the guests slowly set their napkin down, their attention fully captured, because what was happening now was no longer a confrontation, it was a redefinition. And Olivia straightened slightly, her hands still on the table, her expression composed but no longer leading, and she said, "So what does that mean for me?" And the question was no longer about control, it was about position, and Margaret did not rush to answer. She reached for her glass, taking a small sip of water, the motion unhurried, deliberate, as if reminding the room that time itself had shifted in her favor, and then she placed the glass back down, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table, and she said, "That depends on what you choose next." And the sentence did not close the conversation, it opened it, placing the outcome not in the past, but in the decision that had yet to be made. And in that moment, it became clear that the table was no longer a place to sit, it was a place to be measured. And everyone present understood that what happened next would define more than just this day. The room did not move forward. It held, suspended in that fragile space between what had been said and what had to be decided. And Olivia felt it pressing in on her from every side, not loud, not aggressive, but steady, like a quiet current shifting direction beneath her feet. And for the first time since the afternoon began, she did not respond immediately, because the question she had asked had come back to her in a way she had not anticipated, not as an answer, but as a responsibility. And she glanced briefly at Daniel, as if searching for alignment, for support, for something familiar to anchor herself to. But Daniel did not offer it, not out of rejection, but because he was no longer certain where he stood, and that uncertainty changed everything. And Margaret remained still, her presence no longer reactive, no longer waiting, but centered, as if the outcome of this moment did not depend on her control, but on their choices, and Olivia straightened slightly, her voice quieter. Now, more deliberate. I have always respected this family, she said, and the sentence sounded practiced, shaped by habit more than reflection, and Margaret listened, not interrupting, not correcting, allowing the words to exist fully before responding, because sometimes people reveal more in what they choose to repeat than in what they choose to change, and Olivia continued. Everything I have done has been to protect what we have built, and the phrase protect what we have built lingered, echoing Daniel's earlier words, and the connection did not go unnoticed, not by Margaret, not by the guests, and not by the man who stood quietly beside her, observing with the kind of patience that comes from already understanding the end of the conversation. And Margaret finally spoke, her tone calm, but with a clarity that cut through the room. Without force, protection without understanding becomes control, and the distinction settled immediately, because it reframed Olivia's intention into something that required examination, and Olivia's expression tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition that the narrative she had been holding was no longer stable, and Daniel looked down at the table, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of his plate, as if grounding himself in something physical while everything else shifted, and he said, "We thought we were building something strong," his voice quieter, reflective, "but maybe we were just building something comfortable." And the difference between strong and comfortable hung there, subtle but significant, and Margaret nodded once, acknowledging the insight without amplifying it, because realization carries its own weight when it is allowed to stand. And at the far end of the table, one of the guests leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that suggested the moment had moved beyond tension into something more permanent, something that would not easily be undone, and Olivia placed both hands flat on the table again. But this time the gesture was different, less about control, more about grounding, and she said, "Then tell me what you expect." And the question was no longer defensive, it was searching, and Margaret did not answer immediately. She let the room settle around that question, let the weight of it become clear before responding, and then she said, "I do not expect anything," her voice steady. "I observe." And the word observe shifted the focus entirely, because it removed demand and replaced it with awareness, and she continued, "And what I have seen today tells me everything I need to know." And the sentence did not accuse, it concluded, and Olivia's gaze lowered slightly, just for a moment, before returning, because even in uncertainty, she was not someone who retreated easily, and Daniel looked at his mother. Again, the distance between them no longer defined by misunderstanding, but by the space that now needed to be crossed intentionally, and the man beside Margaret remained silent, his presence no longer introducing change, but confirming it, and in that quiet, unmistakable shift, it became clear that the next move would not be about reclaiming control, but about choosing who they were willing to become in front of the person who had never needed to prove who she was. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was defined, shaped by everything that had already been revealed, and for the first time that afternoon, no one was waiting for Margaret to speak, because what needed to be said was no longer hers alone to carry, and Daniel understood that before anyone else, his gaze steady now, no longer shifting, no longer avoiding. As he looked directly at Olivia and then back at his mother, the distance between those two looks carrying the weight of a choice that had not existed before this moment, and he said, "We have been deciding without understanding." His voice calm but firm, and the words did not challenge, they acknowledged, and that acknowledgement shifted the balance further, because it came from within, not from outside, and Olivia felt it immediately, the ground beneath her no longer stable in the way she had relied on, and she straightened again, her posture composed but her expression no longer certain, and she said, "So what are you saying?" And the question was directed at Daniel now, not Margaret, because she sensed that the decision had moved, that influence had shifted in a way she could not fully control, and Daniel did not hesitate this time, not because he had all the answers, but because he understood the direction, and he said, "I am saying we need to stop deciding based on what is easy." And the word easy landed differently than comfortable had earlier, sharper, more personal, and he glanced at the table, at the arrangement that had seemed so natural just minutes ago, now clearly intentional in a way he could not ignore, and he reached forward, his hand moving to the edge of the place setting that had been removed, his fingers pausing there for a second before he looked at one of the staff members standing quietly near the wall and said, "Please bring back the setting that was here." And the request was simple, but the meaning behind it carried through the entire room, because it was not about plates or utensils, it was about correction, and the staff member hesitated only briefly before nodding and stepping away, the quiet efficiency of the movement reinforcing that the decision had been accepted without question. And Olivia watched it happen, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in recalculation, because this was no longer about controlling a situation. It was about responding to one she had not anticipated, and she said, "Daniel, this is unnecessary." Her voice steady but lower now, more controlled, as if volume itself might disrupt what little authority remained. And Daniel shook his head once, not aggressively, but with certainty. "No," he said, and the simplicity of the response carried more weight than any explanation could have. And Margaret observed all of it without interrupting, her expression unchanged, because this was the moment she had been waiting for, not the reveal of truth, but the response to it. And the man beside her remained silent, his role complete in this phase, his presence now simply reinforcing what had already been set in motion. And the guests at the table leaned slightly forward again, not out of curiosity alone, but because they understood they were witnessing the turning point, the moment where acknowledgement becomes action. And when the staff member returned, carrying the place setting with careful precision, the sound of porcelain touching the table was soft, almost unnoticeable, but in that moment, it felt louder than anything else that had happened that afternoon. And Daniel stepped back slightly, giving space for the setting to be arranged, his gaze steady, his decision clear. And Olivia looked at the restored place, then at Margaret, and for the first time, there was no attempt to reframe, no attempt to redirect, only a brief pause as she processed what this meant. And Margaret finally moved her hand slightly, resting it near the newly placed setting, not claiming it, not emphasizing it, simply acknowledging it as part of the table once again. And in that quiet, deliberate restoration, it became clear that what had been removed was never truly gone, and what had been overlooked was now impossible to ignore. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, the movement subtle but deliberate, a quiet command that the room immediately registered, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was expectant, thick with the weight of anticipation, because everyone present knew that what happened next would define more than just this afternoon. It would define the understanding of authority and presence in a space that had been contested only minutes before. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting lightly on the table, observing the subtle exchange between his mother and Olivia, noticing the tension in the slight stiffening of Olivia's shoulders, the controlled blink of her eyes, all signs of calculation. And he realized that the dynamics of the room had shifted entirely, not by argument or confrontation, but by quiet assertion and clarity. And the man standing beside Margaret remained unmoving, a silent observer, reinforcing with his presence the balance that had now tipped toward calm certainty. And Margaret's gaze swept the table slowly, taking in each face, not in judgment, not in evaluation, but in recognition, acknowledging the people before her as witnesses to the truth that had emerged. And she said softly, her voice even, measured, "Everything that has been revealed here today is not a challenge, it is an opportunity." And the phrasing caused small ripples of acknowledgement to move across the guests, because opportunity implies choice and responsibility, not blame. And Olivia's eyes shifted briefly toward Daniel, a flicker of consideration crossing her features, and she realized that the argument she had intended to make no longer fit the space, that her prior control was irrelevant in the face of patience and observation. And she remained seated, adjusting her hands slightly on the table, the movement small but deliberate, grounding herself as she prepared to respond. And Margaret continued, "It is not the seat, the arrangement, or the gesture that defines respect. It is the understanding of presence, patience, and intention." And the words sank in, slowly, because their meaning was not immediate but cumulative, gathering weight as each person considered the implications. And Daniel's posture relaxed, the tension he had been holding since the beginning easing slightly, as he understood the nuance of the situation, the subtle interplay of perception, decision, and responsibility, and he looked at his mother, his voice quiet, steady. "I understand now." And the acknowledgement did not require further argument, because understanding carries its own resolution, and Olivia, noticing the shift, allowed a small exhale. Controlled, as if conceding silently that the balance had moved, and she said nothing, letting the weight of Margaret's words, the presence of her authority, and the careful observation of all parties stand without interruption, and Margaret rested her hands lightly on the table, fingers interlacing for a brief moment, signaling both composure and presence, and she said, "We all have a choice in this moment, how we act, what we acknowledge, and how we proceed." And the room held still, each person considering the consequences and possibilities of that statement, and Daniel nodded slightly, signaling his agreement not through words, but through posture, aligning himself with the gravity and clarity that Margaret had created, and the man beside her finally shifted slightly, a subtle gesture of reinforcement, as if to underline the transition from tension to understanding, and in that quiet, deliberate orchestration, it became evident to everyone present that the table was more than a place to sit. It was a reflection of awareness, intention, and the decisions that define the relationships that occupy it. And Margaret's presence, calm and unwavering, established the precedent that would carry forward beyond this afternoon, not as authority imposed, but as authority understood, recognized, and acknowledged by all. Margaret allowed the quiet to stretch, not for effect, but to let the weight of the moment settle fully into the room, and the guests shifted subtly, their attention sharpening, because the balance of authority had already changed, and Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the gravity of the choice they were all witnessing, a realization dawning that the afternoon was no longer about gestures or appearances, it was about recognition, understanding, and alignment, and Olivia's hands rested flat against the table, her composure intact, but a subtle tension in her shoulders revealed the recalibration happening inside her, as if she was calculating how to navigate a space she had thought she controlled, and she said quietly, "Then how do we move forward?" And the words carried an honesty that the room absorbed immediately, because forward was no longer just continuation, it was construction, it required intention. And Margaret nodded once, small, deliberate, acknowledging the question without answering directly, allowing its weight to settle, and she said, "By choosing carefully, by observing fully, and by respecting the presence of those who have been patient," and the phrasing caused a ripple across the table, eyes meeting eyes. Small nods exchanged, because the principle was simple, yet profound, and Daniel leaned back slightly, noticing for the first time the subtle shifts of body language, the micro-movements that signaled agreement or hesitation, and he said softly, "It is clearer now." And the clarity was mutual, sensed in the way the man beside Margaret relaxed slightly, no longer a catalyst, but a support, reinforcing what had been established, and the guests, absorbing the dynamic, began to feel the subtle gravity, the recognition that what was occurring was more than protocol. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of authority, patience, and strategy, and Olivia looked toward Margaret again, her voice measured. "I see." And the simplicity of the word belied the internal processing, the careful assessment of position, responsibility, and implication, and Margaret's gaze met hers, calm, unyielding, a quiet assertion that the understanding had shifted, and she said, "Understanding comes first, action comes next." And the room absorbed the statement without immediate response, because wisdom does not need applause, it merely needs recognition, and Daniel's eyes met his mother's, a silent agreement passing between them, the kind that requires no words, only presence, and the man beside her adjusted slightly, a gesture of reinforcement, subtle, almost imperceptible, confirming that observation and patience had achieved their own authority, and Olivia exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging that the balance had been irrevocably altered, and the room seemed to tilt subtly toward Margaret's composure, not because of force, but because the logic, the presence, and the clarity of the moment had established a natural pivot, and Margaret rested her hands lightly on the table, one finger tracing an edge, signaling continuity and presence without demand, and the guests leaned forward unconsciously, as if the air itself had shifted, carrying weight and meaning, and Daniel allowed a small smile, barely perceptible, a recognition of what had been achieved through patience, awareness, and observation. And the man beside Margaret finally straightened, his role shifting to silent witness, as the room held, poised at the edge of action, anticipation, and clarity. And in that suspended moment, it became evident that the table, the room, and everyone within it were aligned, not through confrontation, not through assertion, but through the subtle orchestration of presence, understanding, and deliberate choice. And Margaret, sitting calmly, exuded the quiet authority of someone who had never truly lost her place. And in that balance, the possibilities of what came next hung in the air, deliberate, poised, and unmistakably hers to define. The table seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the room, a subtle pulse that each person felt as if the space itself had adopted a new cadence. And Margaret leaned back slightly, letting her presence fill the area without haste, without overt assertion, her eyes moving across the faces that had shifted from challenge to contemplation. And Daniel felt a quiet relief, a recognition that the moment had not required confrontation but clarity. And Olivia's posture relaxed marginally, though the tension in her shoulders lingered, a reminder that awareness had replaced control. And she said quietly, "I will follow your lead." Her voice measured, not submissive but acknowledging, and the phrasing drew attention not to power but to intention. And Margaret nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, signaling that the acknowledgement had been received and understood. And the man beside her shifted minimally, allowing a slight distance, reinforcing the gravity of presence without adding pressure. And the guests, sensing the transformation in the room, leaned forward subtly, their attention absorbed, not by spectacle, but by the unfolding of deliberate choice and observation. And Margaret rested her hands lightly on the table, her fingers tracing the edge almost imperceptibly, a gesture that anchored the moment, signaling calm, awareness, and measured authority. And Daniel mirrored her subtly, his posture straightened, aligning himself with the clarity that had been established. And Olivia's gaze moved from one person to another, registering subtle cues of alignment, recalibration, and the quiet assertion of principles. And she said, "Then we proceed carefully," her tone even, acknowledging the new understanding while maintaining her own presence within it. And the table seemed to settle with her words, the weight of deliberation replacing uncertainty, the sequence of interactions creating a new structure of observation, awareness, and choice. And Margaret finally spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "Careful observation is more powerful than loud assertion, and understanding holds more weight than immediate reaction." And the room absorbed the statement, allowing the phrasing to permeate without interruption, because words spoken with intent carry gravity that is impossible to dismiss. And Daniel exhaled slightly, a subtle, controlled breath, recognizing that the room had shifted from a space of contention to one of reflection. And the guests adjusted in their seats unconsciously, acknowledging the careful orchestration of presence, patience, and deliberate action. And Olivia lowered her hands slightly, resting them against the table, the gesture signaling acceptance of the dynamics without full capitulation. And Margaret's gaze swept the room once more, not in judgment, but in observation. And she said, "We choose our actions today, not to assert dominance, but to acknowledge presence, responsibility, and the shared understanding that guides this space." And the words settled into the air, absorbing the attention and compliance of the group. And Daniel allowed a faint, controlled nod, aligning with the authority that had emerged organically through awareness rather than confrontation. And the man beside Margaret exhaled softly, confirming the shift, while maintaining the quiet vigilance of presence. And Margaret rested both hands lightly on the table, signaling finality in observation, poise and authority, and the unspoken promise that the guidance she offered was steady, considered, and enduring. And the table itself seemed to acknowledge the transformation, no longer a battleground but a space defined by deliberate choice, reflective action, and the clarity of those who understood the weight of presence. And in that suspended, intentional stillness, the possibilities of what came next lay poised, measured, and entirely within the awareness and discernment of those who were present. Margaret exhaled slowly, a quiet, controlled breath that seemed to settle over the entire room. and the guests leaned in slightly, drawn not by action, but by the weight of intention and the clarity of presence, and Daniel straightened in his chair, feeling the culmination of the afternoon pressing into each moment, a recognition that the choices made here were more meaningful than any gesture, any arrangement, any assertion of authority, and Olivia remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the table, eyes scanning the subtle expressions of everyone present, understanding that the dynamics had shifted irrevocably, that patience, observation, and clarity had determined the new balance, and she spoke softly, deliberately. Then we proceed with awareness. And the words carried the weight of acknowledgement, admitting the shift without diminishing her own presence. And Margaret nodded once, slight, deliberate, signaling recognition without command, her gaze moving over each person at the table, acknowledging their presence, their comprehension, and their roles in the new alignment. And Daniel exhaled again, quieter now, internalizing the responsibility that came with understanding, and the man beside Margaret shifted slightly, a subtle movement that reinforced the careful balance of presence, patience, and deliberate choice, and the guests adjusted their posture, unconsciously aligning with the transformation, sensing the weight of observation and the power of calm authority, and Margaret rested her hands lightly on the table, fingers interlacing for a brief moment, signaling composure, presence, and the enduring impact of her decisions, and Daniel glanced at her, a faint, controlled nod passing between them, communicating acknowledgement without words. And Olivia allowed a small exhale, her eyes lowering briefly, then lifting to the others around her, gauging the understanding that had settled across the room, and she said quietly, "I understand the perspective now," her tone even, measured, carrying recognition and acceptance of the balance that had been established, and Margaret's gaze met hers, calm, unyielding, a quiet affirmation of observation and clarity, and the man beside her exhaled softly, confirming the shift, while remaining unobtrusive, and the room seemed to settle with this acknowledgement, the subtle movements, the small nods, and the quiet breaths collectively defining a new understanding, a measured alignment that transcended confrontation, assertion, or display, and Margaret's presence remained at the center, steady, deliberate, guiding the rhythm of observation and choice, while Daniel mirrored the subtle authority through posture and awareness, and Olivia adjusted minutely, recognizing the necessity of respect, reflection, and careful consideration, and the guests, observing silently, sensed that the afternoon had moved from tension to clarity, from uncertainty to understanding, and that what had once been a contested space now existed in equilibrium, poised on patience, awareness, and the deliberate decisions of those who had acknowledged presence, and Margaret's fingers rested lightly on the table once more, signaling finality, composure, and the quiet power of understanding, and in that stillness, the room held, poised between reflection and possibility. The table no longer a place of contention, but a space defined by deliberate choice, awareness, and the clarity that comes from observing before acting, and in that moment, it became unmistakably clear to everyone present that the person who had been removed from her place had never truly lost it, and that understanding, patience, and deliberate presence had ensured that the final word rested quietly, powerfully, and irrevocably with her.